In the winter of 1856, in the remote valleys of northern Pennsylvania, a traveling minister named Reverend Elijah Thorne arrived in the isolated settlement of Ashford Hollow with nothing but a leather-bound journal, a silver cross worn smooth by anxious fingers, and a message he claimed came directly from the mouth of God. The 43 families who called that frozen valley home had no way of knowing that within 9 months, 140 of their neighbors would vanish into a darkness so complete that even their names would be scratched from family Bibles, their faces turned to blank walls and daguerreotype portraits, and their existence denied by the very people who had loved them. Before we descend into what historians would later call the Ashford erasure, I want to know where you're watching from right now, and what time it is in your part of the world, because what happened in that valley challenges everything we understand about the human mind's capacity for surrender, and I need you fully present for what comes next. The first sign that something had shifted in Ashford Hollow came on February 19th, when a farmhand named Thomas Whitley walked into the general store owned by Marcus Reed and asked, in a voice stripped of all emotion, whether Marcus had seen Thomas's wife Catherine that morning. Marcus, who had sold Catherine a pound of coffee beans less than an hour earlier, looked at Thomas with confusion and said yes. She had just left. Thomas stared at Marcus for a long moment, his eyes carrying a blankness that Marcus would later describe to investigators as the look of a man trying to remember a dream he'd never had. And then Thomas simply nodded, purchased a box of nails he didn't need, and walked back into the February cold without another word about his wife. What Marcus didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Thomas Whitley had just attended his 3rd consecutive night of what Reverend Crowther called Midnight Reconciliation, a gathering held in the abandoned Pritchard barn on the western edge of the settlement, and that Catherine's name had been spoken during something Crowther referred to as the unburdening ceremony. The Pritchard barn had stood empty for 2 years, ever since old Gerald Pritchard had hanged himself from the hayloft beam after his daughter died of scarlet fever, and the building had developed the kind of reputation that kept children away and made adults quicken their pace when passing. Crowther had chosen it deliberately. He had arrived in Ashford Hollow on January 3rd, 1856, during a blizzard so severe that the stagecoach driver had refused to go further, leaving Crowther to walk the final 3 miles through snow that reached his thighs. And the families who took him in that first night, the Blackwoods, a family of 5 who ran a small dairy operation, would later tell investigators that Crowther had barely seemed cold despite his inadequate coat, and that he had spent the entire evening staring into their fireplace without blinking, occasionally whispering words they couldn't quite hear. Margaret Blackwood, the eldest daughter, had been 17 years old and engaged to marry a young carpenter named John Dietrich that coming spring, and she remembered that Crowther had asked her, in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere behind his own throat, whether she had ever felt the weight of memories she wished she could set down like stones pulled from a sack. Margaret had laughed nervously and said everyone feels that way sometimes, and Crowther had smiled a smile that Margaret would describe 11 months later as the expression of a man watching something burn that he himself had lit, and told her that God had shown him a way to make that weight disappear forever. Within a week, Crowther had secured permission from the town council to use the Pritchard barn for evening prayer services, and within 2 weeks, 47 people were attending regularly, and by the end of February, that number had swelled to 93. The people of Ashford Hollow were not uneducated or superstitious by the standards of 1856. Many could read, several families subscribed to newspapers from Philadelphia and New York, and the settlement had a functional school that operated 8 months of the year. But they were isolated, locked into a valley that became impassable for weeks at a time during winter, and they carried the particular loneliness of frontier life, the kind that makes people hungry for connection, for meaning, for someone who speaks with absolute certainty about the purpose of suffering. Crowther's sermons were not like the traditional fire and brimstone preaching common to that era. Instead, he spoke in a low, rhythmic cadence about the tyranny of the past, about how memory itself was a form of imprisonment, about how the human mind was not meant to carry the accumulated weight of years, but to exist in a state of perpetual present, unburdened and pure. He told them that Christ's true message had been corrupted by centuries of misinterpretation, that the resurrection was not about the body, but about the mind's ability to shed its former self like a snake sheds dead skin, and that he had been chosen selected by visions that came to him in dreams so vivid he could taste the ash in the air and feel the heat of divine fire on his face to guide them toward what he called the second innocence. The phrase appeared again and again in the journal he kept, a journal that would be found years later in a false bottom of a trunk buried 3 feet beneath the barn's dirt floor. And in that journal, Crowther had written detailed notes about each person who attended his services, documenting their fears, their regrets, their secrets confessed during private counseling sessions, and beside each name, he had drawn small symbols, circles within circles for those he deemed ready, triangles for those who resisted, and crosses, simple crosses, for those he had decided would need to be erased first. Catherine Whitley's name had a cross beside it, drawn in ink so dark it had bled through to the next page. The midnight reconciliations began in late February, invitation-only gatherings that Crowther claimed were for those who had demonstrated true spiritual readiness, and the sessions lasted 4 to 6 hours, running deep into the night when exhaustion makes the mind more susceptible to suggestion. When the barriers between rational thought and acceptance begin to crumble, people who attended these sessions came home changed in ways their families couldn't quite articulate. Not injured, not sick, but altered, as if some essential component of their personality had been carefully removed and replaced with something smoother, something that didn't catch on the ordinary friction of daily life. Sarah Hendricks, a widow who ran the settlement's only boarding house, attended her first midnight reconciliation on February 28th, and when she returned home at dawn, her son Robert found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wall where a portrait of her late husband had hung for 6 years. Robert asked if she was all right, and Sarah turned to him with an expression of genuine confusion and asked, "Who is the man in that picture?" Robert initially thought she was joking, but Sarah's confusion was absolute, and when he pressed her, she became agitated, insisting that she had never seen that man before, that the portrait must belong to someone else. And could Robert please remove it because it was making her uncomfortable to have a stranger's face watching her in her own home. Robert Hendricks would later testify to investigators that his mother spent the next 3 days systematically going through the house and removing every item that had belonged to his father, clothing, tools, books, even the man's reading glasses, and piling them in the yard. And when Robert tried to stop her, Sarah had looked at him with something approaching pity and said, "You're still carrying weight that isn't yours, but don't worry. The Reverend can help you set it down too." The pattern repeated across Ashford Hollow throughout March and early April. People attended Crowther's midnight reconciliations and returned home unable to remember specific individuals, events, or entire chapters of their own lives. But rather than displaying distress, they seemed relieved, even grateful, speaking about their memory loss as if it were a gift they had been waiting their entire lives to receive. And here is where the true horror of the Ashford erasure begins to take shape, because the people who lost their memories didn't just forget. They actively participated in erasing all physical evidence of what they had forgotten, removing photographs, burning letters, destroying personal belongings. And when family members tried to remind them of the people or events they had forgotten, they would become hostile, accusing their loved ones of lying, of trying to burden them with false histories, of attempting to trap them in a past that had never actually existed. By mid-April, the Blackwood family had fractured in a way that illuminated the true mechanics of Crowther's method, and what happened to them would become the key evidence investigators used to understand the systematic nature of the erasure. Margaret Blackwood, the 17-year-old daughter who had first spoken with Crowther that January night, had been attending the midnight reconciliation since early March, and her fiancé John Dietrich had grown increasingly alarmed by the changes in her behavior. The way she spoke about their upcoming wedding with a detachment that suggested she was discussing someone else's life entirely. On April 14th, John arrived at the Blackwood farm to find Margaret standing in the yard burning a wooden hope chest that her mother had spent 2 years carving and filling with linens and dresses for the marriage. And when John grabbed her arms and demanded to know what she was doing, Margaret looked at him with the calm expression of someone explaining something simple to a child, and said she didn't know why she had this chest or who these items were meant for, but they didn't belong to her anymore. John shook her, probably harder than he intended, and asked about their wedding, about the plans they had made, about the life they were supposed to build together, and Margaret's face showed no recognition, no flicker of connection, nothing except a mild confusion as she gently pulled away from him and said, "I'm sorry. but I don't know who you are, and I think it's best if you leave before you upset yourself further." John Dietrich went immediately to Margaret's father, Edmund Blackwood, a man known throughout the settlement for his level head and practical nature. And Edmund listened to John's concerns with a patience that seemed forced. And then Edmund said something that would appear in multiple testimonies from that period, a phrase that seemed to spread through Crowther's followers like a verbal contagion. "The past is a weight we were never meant to carry, and my daughter has been given the grace to set hers down." When John pressed Edmund, demanding to know what Crowther was doing to these people, Edmund's expression shifted from patience to something colder, and he told John that if he truly loved Margaret, he would attend the midnight reconciliation himself and understand the gift that was being offered, and if John wasn't willing to do that, then he should leave the Blackwood property and not return. The settlement's doctor, a man named Vincent Aldridge, who had trained in Philadelphia and maintained a correspondence with colleagues in Boston and New York, became the first person to formally document what he recognized as a medical crisis, though his understanding of the mechanisms involved would prove tragically incomplete. Dr. Aldridge had been called to examine several individuals who family members claimed were suffering from sudden and severe memory loss, and his initial examinations revealed no physical trauma, no evidence of disease, no signs of the brain fevers or head injuries that typically accompanied such symptoms. The patients could remember how to speak, how to perform their daily tasks, how to read and write. They retained all their practical knowledge and skills, but specific episodic memories, particularly those involving emotional connections to other people, had been selectively removed as if surgically excised from their minds. Dr. Aldridge wrote in his journal, which would later be submitted as evidence, that he had never encountered anything like this pattern in his medical training, that it suggested a level of psychological manipulation he had only read about in theoretical papers from European alienists who studied mesmerism and the power of suggestion, and that he believed Reverend Crowther was employing some technique that combined sleep deprivation, rhythmic verbal patterns, and the exploitation of grief and guilt to systematically rewrite his followers' memories. On April 22nd, Dr. Aldridge attempted to confront Crowther directly, arriving at the Pritchard barn during an evening service, and what he witnessed there would shake his rational, scientific worldview to its foundations. The barn was lit by dozens of candles arranged in concentric circles, and approximately 80 people sat on rough wooden benches, but they weren't singing hymns or praying in any traditional sense. Instead, they were engaged in what Crowther called the naming, where individuals would stand and speak aloud the names of people they wanted to forget, and the entire congregation would repeat those names back in unison, over and over, sometimes for 10 or 15 minutes, until the name itself seemed to lose meaning and become nothing more than a sound, empty of association or memory. Dr. Aldridge watched as a young mother named Elizabeth Thornton stood and spoke the name of her daughter who had died the previous winter, a 4-year-old named Lucy who had frozen to death when she wandered from the house during a blizzard, and Elizabeth repeated Lucy's name with increasing urgency while the congregation echoed it back, and Aldridge could see the moment when something broke inside Elizabeth, when her face went slack and her eyes lost focus. And when the naming finally ended, Elizabeth sat down with an expression of profound peace, and Crowther asked her if she still carried the weight of that name, and Elizabeth said no, she didn't recognize that name anymore, it was just a sound that meant nothing. And the congregation murmured their approval like witnesses to a miracle. Aldridge tried to interrupt, to explain that what they were doing was dangerous, that they were destroying the fundamental architecture of human identity. But Crowther looked at him with eyes that reflected the candlelight in a way that made them seem entirely black. And Crowther said in that low, rhythmic voice that had captured so many others, "Doctor, you carry the weight of every patient you couldn't save. Don't you? I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, in the lines around your mouth. What would you give to set that burden down?" And Aldridge felt something shift inside him, a pull toward the simplicity of forgetting, toward the relief of not carrying the faces of the 3 children who had died from diphtheria the previous year despite his best efforts. And he stumbled backward out of the barn and ran to his house and locked the door and didn't emerge for 2 days. When he finally came out, he immediately wrote letters to the authorities in Harrisburg, detailing everything he had witnessed and begging for intervention, but those letters would take weeks to reach their destination. And by then, the situation in Ashford Hollow would have progressed far beyond anything Aldridge could have imagined. The erasure entered its most disturbing phase in early May, when Crowther introduced what he called the witnessing, a practice where people who had already undergone memory erasure would actively help others forget by serving as living proof that life without the burden of the past was not only possible, but superior. The witnessing sessions were held during the day, in people's homes, and they had a veneer of normalcy that made them even more insidious than the midnight gatherings. A person struggling with grief or guilt would be visited by 3 or 4 of Crowther's followers, people they had known for years, neighbors and friends who now spoke with absolute certainty about the freedom they had found through forgetting, and these witnesses would spend hours, sometimes entire days, methodically talking the person through their resistance, addressing every objection, every fear, every reason to hold on to their memories, until the person's defenses crumbled under the sustained pressure of gentle, relentless persuasion. Hannah Pritchard, the daughter of the man who had hanged himself in the barn where Crowther now held his ceremonies, had resisted the erasure longer than most, telling anyone who would listen that what Crowther was doing was evil, that he was stealing people's souls by taking their memories, that someone needed to stop him before the entire settlement was consumed. On May 8th, Hannah was visited by her aunt, her childhood best friend, and 2 women she had known since she was a child, all of them transformed by Crowther's process, and they stayed with Hannah for 14 hours, taking turns speaking to her about the pain she carried from her father's suicide, about how she blamed herself for not recognizing the signs, about how that guilt was poisoning her chance at happiness, and around midnight, something in Hannah broke, and she agreed to attend the next midnight reconciliation. 3 days later, Hannah Pritchard walked into the general store and asked Marcus Reed if he had any rope for sale. And when Marcus asked what she needed it for, Hannah said she wanted to hang something in the barn but couldn't remember what, and Marcus noticed that Hannah was wearing her father's old coat, the same coat Gerald had been wearing when they cut him down. But when Marcus mentioned this, Hannah looked confused and said the coat had been in her closet and she liked how it fit, but she didn't know who it had belonged to before. And anyway, did Marcus have the rope or not? Marcus sold her the rope, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And later that afternoon, Hannah was seen going into the Pritchard barn with 3 other women, and when they emerged 2 hours later, they were carrying bundles of what looked like clothing and personal items, and they burned everything in a fire pit behind the barn while Crowther watched and spoke words that witnesses could hear but couldn't quite understand, phrases that seemed to blur together into a droning chant that made people's heads ache if they listened too closely. By mid-May, 140 people in Ashford Hollow had undergone some form of memory erasure, and the settlement had begun to fracture into 2 distinct populations, those who had been transformed by Crowther's process and those who resisted. And the tension between these groups was escalating in ways that suggested violence was inevitable. The resistors, led by John Dietrich and a farmer named Robert Cunningham, began meeting secretly to plan some form of intervention, but they faced a terrible problem. Many of them had family members who had joined Crowther, and any action they took against the Reverend would necessarily put their loved ones at risk. On May 19th, the resistors attempted to forcibly remove Crowther from the settlement. A group of 12 men who armed themselves with farm tools and rode to the Pritchard barn, intending to drive Crowther out or, if necessary, kill him. But when they arrived, they found the barn surrounded by nearly 100 of Crowther's followers, including many of their own wives, children, and parents. And these followers stood in silence, forming a human barrier. And when John Dietrich tried to push through to reach Crowther, his own former fiancée Margaret stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest and said, in a voice completely empty of recognition, "You need to leave now. This is not your place anymore." The standoff lasted 4 hours. 12 armed men facing a silent wall of neighbors who looked at them with the blank patience of people waiting for something inevitable. And what broke John Dietrich wasn't violence or threats, but the gradual realization that the people he was trying to save no longer wanted to be saved, that they had chosen this emptiness, or believed they had chosen it, and that any attempt to force them back into their memories would be seen not as rescue but as assault. Robert Cunningham, standing beside John with a pitchfork gripped in white-knuckled hands, finally lowered his weapon and said what they were all thinking, that they had already lost, that the people they loved were gone even though their bodies remained, and that staying in Ashford Hollow meant either joining Crowther's flock or watching helplessly as everyone they cared about disappeared into a fog of manufactured amnesia. The resistors left that night, 12 men and their families, 37 people total who gathered what possessions they could carry and walked out of the valley in darkness. And several of them would later tell investigators that as they crested the ridge above the settlement, they looked back and saw fires burning throughout Ashford Hollow, not destructive fires, but controlled burns in yards and fields, and they realized the remaining population was systematically destroying every record, every photograph, every letter and diary and personal belonging that might serve as evidence of the memories they were being taught to erase. John Dietrich made it as far as Williamsport before the weight of what he had lost became unbearable, and on June 3rd, 1856, he walked into the Susquehanna River with his pockets full of stones and was found 3 days later by fishermen who noted in their report to the local sheriff that the young man's face held an expression not of fear or pain, but of something closer to confusion, as if he had died trying to remember something important that remained just beyond his grasp. Dr. Vincent Aldridge's letters finally reached the authorities in Harrisburg in late May, and by early June, a territorial marshal named Samuel Brennan had been dispatched to investigate the situation in Ashford Hollow, accompanied by 2 deputies and a physician from the state asylum who specialized in disorders of the mind. They arrived on June 14th, expecting to find evidence of some religious mania or perhaps a confidence scheme where Crowther was extracting money or property from vulnerable people. But what they discovered was far stranger and more disturbing than anything their experience had prepared them for. The settlement appeared to be functioning normally on the surface. People were working their farms, the general store was open, children were visible in the schoolyard, but something was fundamentally wrong in ways that took hours to articulate. Marshal Brennan noted in his official report that conversations with residents felt like speaking to people who had learned human behavior from a manual but didn't quite understand the underlying emotions, that they would answer questions politely but without any real engagement, and that they seemed unable or unwilling to discuss their personal histories beyond the most recent few weeks. When Brennan asked Margaret Blackwood about her family, she could tell him her name and her current age, but couldn't recall her parents' names or where she had been born. And when he showed her a wedding announcement he had found in the settlement records listing her engagement to John Dietrich, Margaret studied it with genuine puzzlement and said she supposed she must have written that, but she had no memory of the person named in the document, and actually, she didn't remember writing it either. And would the marshal mind if she burned this paper because having evidence of things she couldn't remember made her feel anxious in a way she didn't like? The deputies found Reverend Crowther in the Pritchard barn, sitting on a wooden chair in the center of those concentric circles of candles. And he greeted them with a warmth that seemed completely sincere, inviting them to sit, asking if they had eaten, offering them water from a clay pitcher that sat on a small table beside his journal. Crowther was 42 years old, thin to the point of gauntness, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that the physician would later describe as possessing an unusual quality of focus, as if he could look not merely at a person but through them, into the spaces where they kept their secrets and their shame. Marshal Brennan asked Crowther directly what he was doing to the people of Ashford Hollow, and Crowther smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at the question, and said he was freeing them, that he had discovered through years of study and prayer and experimentation that human suffering originated not from circumstance but from memory. The people tortured themselves with the past, replaying their failures and losses and regrets until those memories became more real than their present lives, and that God had shown him a technique to sever those connections, to allow people to exist in a state of continuous present without the crushing weight of accumulated pain. Brennan asked how this technique worked, and Crowther explained, with the casual tone of someone discussing a farming method or a recipe, that it required first the exhaustion of the conscious mind through extended periods of focused attention, then the systematic linguistic deconstruction of specific memories through repetitive naming until the words lost their associative meaning, and finally the social reinforcement of the new identity through community witnessing that made the erasure feel not like loss, but like liberation. The physician from the asylum interrupted to say that what Crowther was describing was essentially the destruction of human personality, that memory was not separate from identity, but constituted its very foundation, and that removing specific memories didn't free people, but rather created damaged versions of themselves, incapable of learning from experience or maintaining meaningful relationships. Crowther listened to this objection with patient interest, and then he asked the physician a question that would be recorded in 3 separate testimonies and would later be studied by alienists and psychologists for decades. He asked, "If a man's leg is caught in a trap and the only way to save his life is to amputate that leg, do you call the surgeon who performs the operation a destroyer of the man, or do you call him a savior?" The Marshals' investigation continued for 3 days, during which they documented 140 residents of Ashford Hollow who showed significant memory impairment consistent with Crowther's process, and another 60 who had participated in his gatherings but had not yet undergone complete erasure, and approximately 40 individuals, mostly children and elderly people who Crowther had deemed unsuitable for his technique, who retained their memories but lived in a settlement that no longer acknowledged the reality they remembered. Marshal Brennan attempted to arrest Crowther on June 16th, charging him with fraud and endangerment. But when the deputies moved to restrain him, the 140 erased individuals surrounded the barn in that same silent, patient formation, and Crowther told Brennan that he would go willingly, that he had no desire for violence, but that his followers would not permit his removal, and that any attempt to force the issue would result in casualties that Brennan would have to carry for the rest of his life. The marshal, recognizing the impossible position he was in, retreated with his deputies to consider options. And that night, while they camped on the ridge above the settlement, they watched as lights moved through Ashford Hollow in patterns that suggested some kind of organized activity. And in the morning, when they descended back into the valley, they found it empty. 140 people had vanished during the night, taking nothing with them except the clothes they wore, leaving behind homes with fires still burning in hearths, food on tables, livestock in barns, and a settlement that looked as if its population had simply evaporated. The remaining residents, those who had retained their memories, could provide no useful information about where the others had gone. Several claimed to have been awake all night and insisted they had seen and heard nothing, and the physical evidence suggested an impossibility, that more than 100 people had left simultaneously without making enough noise to wake anyone, without taking wagons or horses, without leaving tracks that searchers could follow beyond the settlement's borders. Marshal Brennan's official report, filed on June 24, 1856, concluded that Reverend Elijah Crowther had led his followers into the surrounding wilderness, possibly to establish a new settlement beyond territorial jurisdiction, and that while their activities in Ashford Hollow had been deeply disturbing, no specific crime could be charged that would justify the resources required for an extended search through hundreds of square miles of unmapped forest. The case was effectively closed, filed away in territorial archives, and would have remained an obscure historical footnote except for what happened 17 months later, in November of 1857, when a hunting party working the mountains 60 miles northwest of Ashford Hollow discovered a cave system that showed signs of recent habitation, and inside one of the deeper chambers, they found evidence that would finally reveal the ultimate fate of Crowther's 140 followers. The cave walls were covered in writing, thousands of words carved directly into the stone with what must have been tremendous effort over an extended period. And these inscriptions were not the mad ravings investigators might have expected, but rather meticulous, detailed accounts of individual lives, names and dates and relationships and memories, all recorded with desperate precision, as if the writers were trying to preserve something they could feel slipping away. The hunting party found 140 distinct life histories carved into those walls, and at the end of each account, a final sentence that appeared over and over with minor variations. "I write this so that someone will know I existed, because I can no longer remember that I did." The cave also contained 140 bodies, arranged in a circular pattern in the main chamber, all showing signs of death by starvation that had occurred many months earlier, and in the center of that circle, seated on a stone that had been carved into the shape of a throne, was the skeleton of a man identified by the silver cross still hanging around his neck as Reverend Elijah Crowther. The investigation into the cave discovery revealed what had happened during those final months. reconstructed from the cave writings and from the journal found with Crowther's remains, a journal that continued the meticulous documentation he had maintained in Ashford Hollow. Crowther had led his followers into the wilderness with the intention of creating a perfect community, a society of people living entirely in the present without the corruption of memory. But he had miscalculated the practical requirements of survival, and as food supplies dwindled and the reality of their situation became clear, his followers had begun to remember, their memories returning not gradually, but in overwhelming floods that brought with them the full weight of everything they had lost, every person they had forgotten, every moment they had erased, and the psychological impact was catastrophic. The cave writings showed people rediscovering their own identities while simultaneously confronting what they had done to themselves and others, parents remembering children they had denied, spouses remembering marriages they had abandoned, and the guilt and horror became unbearable. Some of the inscriptions suggested that several followers had wanted to leave to return to Ashford Hollow and try to rebuild their lives. But Crowther had convinced them that returning would mean facing the judgment of those they had hurt, that the only path forward was through what he called the final unburdening. And the journal indicated that Crowther had led them in one last ceremony where they systematically erased their memories again, this time completely, removing not specific painful recollections, but everything, their names, their language, their understanding of the world, until they had reduced themselves to something less than human, to organisms that could breathe and move but could no longer remember how to seek food or shelter. And they had simply sat in that cave circle around their teacher and slowly starved while he recorded their transformation in his journal with the clinical detachment of a scientist documenting an experiment. The final entry in Crowther's journal, written in a hand that had become increasingly shaky, stated that he had achieved what he set out to prove, that memory was not essential to human existence, that consciousness could survive without the burden of the past, but that he had also discovered something unexpected, that without memory to give it shape and meaning, consciousness became nothing more than an endless, terrifying present, a now that extended forever, without context or connection, and that his followers in their final state had achieved a kind of existence that was technically life, but so far removed from anything recognizably human that Crowther himself could barely stand to witness it. And in his last coherent sentences, he wrote that he had been wrong. That memory was not a prison, but the very foundation of what made existence bearable, and that in trying to free people from their pain, he had instead created something far worse, a suffering so pure and absolute that it existed outside the boundaries of language or description, and that he hoped whoever found these records would understand that his intentions had been good even if his actions had led to damnation. The 140 bodies were returned to Ashford Hollow and buried in a mass grave on the eastern hill, and the settlement itself never recovered. Most of the remaining families moved away within a year, and by 1860, Ashford Hollow was abandoned. The buildings left to decay, and the name itself was eventually removed from territorial maps. The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to disturb researchers now, is whether Crowther was a calculated predator who knew exactly what he was doing, or whether he genuinely believed he was offering salvation, whether the erasure was murder or mercy gone horrifically wrong. And perhaps the most unsettling aspect is that we will never know the answer, because the only people who understood his true intentions were the 140 who went into that cave and erased themselves so completely that even their final thoughts became inaccessible, lost in a darkness that memory alone could have prevented. If this story has crawled into your mind and made you question how much of your own identity depends on the memories you carry, how fragile the boundary is between liberation and annihilation, then I want you to hit that like button and subscribe to Dark History HD, because there are more stories like this waiting, more moments when humanity looked into the abyss and decided to jump, and I need you here for every single one of them. So subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what you think. Drove those final 40 settlers to stay in that cave rather than save themselves? Was it loyalty, fear, or something else entirely?